Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be we're diving deep into the world of AI models and specifically how they kind of run into some issues with data protection laws, particularly, the GDPR. And to help us with this, we have a real expert in the field here. So the European Data Protection Board, the EDPB, they just released a new opinion 224 to be exact, on December 17, 2024.
It's very timely.
Yeah, it really is. And it asks some pretty big questions. Can AI models that are trained on personal data, can they really ever be considered truly anonymous? Like, is that even possible?
Yeah, big question.
And can companies just use legitimate interest as a reason to use our data for AI development? And what happens? Like, if personal data is used illegally to train AI?
Yeah, all these are the exact kinds of questions the EDPB is currently dealing with. And, their answers to these questions have some pretty major implications for all of us as users.
Right. Yeah, so let's jump right in. Let's start with that first one, that anonymity question. The EDPB states that AI models that are trained on personal data cannot always be considered anonymous. Why is that?
Well, it turns out that AI models, even if they weren't specifically designed to, they can retain information from the data they were trained on. So think of it kind of like an imprint almost that's left on the AI model from that training data. And sometimes that imprint can actually include personal details.
Yeah.
Which makes the whole idea of anonymity, not so straightforward.
Okay, so even if I can't, see my data in an AI model, it could still be in there somewhere?
Potentially, yes.
That's a little creepy.
But what's even more kind of unsettling, I think, is the idea of what's called membership inference attacks. This is where, if someone could figure out, if your data was specifically used to train a particular AI model, they might not be able to extract your data directly.
Yeah.
But they could still figure out if you were part of that training data set.
Hold on. So you're telling me that somebody could find out if my data was used to train, let's say, a medical AI, even if they can't see my actual medical records in that model?
Potentially, yes.
That's pretty unsettling.
Yeah, it could have a pretty big impact, especially if, that kind of information gets into the wrong hands.
Yeah.
So let's just imagine, like a scenario where a company develops an AI, to predict health risks. And let's say they trained it on a data set of health insurance claims. Now somebody who has access to that model could potentially launch one of these membership inference attacks to see if your data was part of that training set. And if they find out that you were included, they could then start to infer things about your health conditions, even though they don't actually have access to your medical records.
Yeah, that's kind of a privacy nightmare. So how does the EDPB even determine if an AI model is truly anonymous? Like, how do they even go about that?
Yeah, it's not a simple process at all. They actually have to evaluate each model on a case-by-case basis. And they take into account a whole range of factors, including the type of AI model, the technology that's available, and even the context of, where that model is being used.
So there's no, magic formula. It's kind of it's more of a judgment call.
Yeah, it is a judgment call. And that's why, the EDPB has outline specific criteria to kind of help guide these evaluations. And one of the key factors is the likelihood of identification. So basically, how likely is it that someone could use reasonable means to identify individuals from the data that's contained within the AI model?
Okay, so it's not just about, if the data is technically anonymous, it's also about the risk of someone being able to re-identify people from that data.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
And to assess that risk, the EDPB looks at a whole range of factors. So they're thinking about the type of data that was used to train the model, how complex the model itself is, the availability of other data sets that could be used to re-identify people, and even the intended use of the model.
So if a model is going to be used in a high-stakes situation, like making decisions about loans or healthcare treatments, the bar for anonymity would have to be, way higher than for, a silly chatbot or something.
Exactly.
Okay.
The potential consequences of re-identification are much greater in those scenarios. So the EDPB would apply much stricter standards in those cases.
Okay, so let's move on to another big question that, we hear a lot, the idea of legitimate interest. A lot of companies, they like to say that they have a legitimate interest in using our data to train AI models. But what does that actually mean? What does that term actually mean?
Yeah, it's a legal concept that's been around for a while. But it's definitely taking on a new significance in the age of AI. Essentially, legitimate interest means that a company can process personal data if they have a genuine, justifiable reason to do so, and if that reason outweighs your privacy rights.
Okay, so that makes sense, but it also seems like it could be kind of a slippery slope. So how do we even know if a company's legitimate interest is actually legitimate?
Right, and that's where the EDPB's three-step test comes in.
Okay, 3 steps. So break that down for me.
All right, so first they look at whether the company's purpose for using that data is lawful and clearly defined. So they can't just say, we want to develop cool AI. They have to have a really specific and legitimate purpose.
So something like, developing a chatbot to improve customer service or, a fraud detection system to protect financial transactions. That would be valid, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Those are actually some of the types of examples that the EDPB mentions in their opinion. So then the second step is what's called the necessity test.
Okay, and what's that?
So in this step, the EDPB is asking, is processing this personal data absolutely essential to achieving that purpose?
Right.
Like, could the company do it without using personal data? Are there other, less intrusive alternatives available?
So they're really pushing companies to think carefully about whether they actually need our data to make their AI work.
Exactly. It's like, don't just collect data because you can. Only collect it if it's truly necessary for that stated purpose.
Makes sense.
And then the third step is the balancing test.
All right, I'm sensing a theme here. Balance seems to be key.
Yeah, it really is. So in the balancing test, the EDPB is weighing the company's interests against the potential risks to your privacy and your other fundamental rights as a data subject.
So when we say risk, what kinds of risks are we talking about? What could happen if a company uses my data to train an AI without my consent?
Yeah, so there's a whole range of potential risks. Things like privacy violations, where your data can be used to create profiles about you, to track your online behavior, or even to target you with personalized advertising.
Right, but that kind of stuff already happens all the time, right? So how is AI changing things?
Right, but AI is making it possible to process and analyze data on a scale that was never before possible. So that means the potential for privacy violations is also being amplified.
Okay, so imagine you find out that your social media posts, your browsing history, your location data, all of that was scraped from the web and used to train an AI model without your knowledge or your consent. How would you feel about that?
Yeah, and this is exactly the kind of scenario that the EDPB wants us to think about. It's about your reasonable expectations. Could you have reasonably expected your data to be used in that way? It's about transparency and respecting your rights.
That makes sense. I wouldn't be too happy if I found out that my data was being used to train some AI without my knowledge. But what if the company anonymizes the data before using it to train the AI? Wouldn't that solve the problem?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it kind of brings us back to that whole issue of anonymity and whether it's actually possible to anonymize data in the context of AI. And, that's something that we're going to dive into deeper in the next part of this deep dive.
Okay, yeah, it sounds like we're getting into some really interesting territory here. So we'll take a quick pause here and we'll be right back to unpack the complexities of anonymization and AI.
Sounds good.
Welcome back. So before the break, we were talking about how AI models can absorb information and whether anonymization is even possible.
Right. And this is where things get a little bit tricky because, a lot of companies think that if they just remove those obvious identifiers from the data, like, names and social security numbers, that suddenly the data is anonymous and they can just use it however they want. But the EDPB is really pushing back on that idea.
So they're saying that even if you remove those obvious identifiers, there could still be other pieces of information that could be used to re-identify someone.
Exactly, yeah. You could think of it kind of like a jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah.
Even if you remove a few pieces, you can often still see the bigger picture. And the same thing kind of applies to data. Even if you remove some identifiers, other pieces of information, when you combine them, could still be used to piece together someone's identity.
So, what kind of information are we talking about here? Besides names and social security numbers, what else could be used to re-identify somebody?
It could be anything, really. Yeah. From their date of birth and zip code to their medical history, their purchase history, their browsing habits, all sorts of things. Individually, these pieces of information might seem harmless, but when you put them all together, they could start to paint a pretty detailed picture of who someone is.
Okay, so let's say a company uses a data set like that, where they've removed names and social security numbers, but they've kept all this other information, and they use that to train an AI model. What's the problem with that?
Well, the problem is that the AI model could still contain, traces of that personal information, even if it's not, directly visible. Remember, AI models, they absorb information from the data they're trained on. So even if the company thinks they've anonymized the data, the AI model itself might still contain enough information to potentially re-identify individuals.
Yeah, I'm starting to see how this whole anonymity thing is a lot more complicated than it might seem at first. It's not just about removing a few obvious identifiers. It's about, really understanding how AI models actually work and thinking about those risks of re-identification.
Exactly, yeah. And the EDPB is really urging companies to take a much more cautious approach here. They're basically saying that if there's any risk of re-identification,
Yeah.
then the data cannot be considered truly anonymous, and you need to get consent before using it to train an AI model.
So it sounds like companies are going to have to really rethink their whole approach to data anonymization when it comes to AI. But how do they actually prove to the authorities that an AI model is truly anonymous? Like, how do they even go about doing that?
Well, the EDPB has outlined some pretty strict criteria that companies need to meet. And it's not enough to just say, trust us, our AI is anonymous.
Mm-hmm.
They have to show their work, so to speak. They need to document their whole process, from how they collected the data to how they trained the AI model.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to demonstrate that they've taken every reasonable precaution to mitigate that risk of re-identification.
So documentation is key here. What kind of documentation are we talking about?
They need to show, the source of the data, the steps they took to anonymize it, the algorithms they used to train the AI model, and any results from tests they conducted to assess that risk of re-identification. So it's a pretty high bar, but the EDPB is making it very clear that they're serious about protecting people's privacy in this age of AI.
Okay, so let's say a company goes through all that trouble, they document everything, they do all the tests, and they satisfy the authorities that their AI model is truly anonymous. Are we in the clear then? Can they use that model however they want?
Well, not so fast, because the EDPB's opinion also addresses what happens if a company uses personal data illegally to train an AI model.
Right, that was that third big question, and we were going to get to in this deep dive.
Exactly, and this is where the EDPB really lays down the law. They're basically saying that if a company uses personal data illegally to train an AI, the supervisory authorities have the power to step in and take action.
Okay, and what kind of action are we talking about here? Like, what are the consequences for companies that don't play by the rules?
Well, it depends on the severity of the violation, but the consequences can be pretty significant. They could face some hefty fines. They could be ordered to delete the illegally obtained data. And in some cases, they could even be ordered to delete the entire AI model that was trained on that data.
So they're not messing around. It sounds like the EDPB is sending a very strong message to companies, like, you can't just treat our data like it's the Wild West anymore.
Exactly. And what's really interesting here is the EDPB is making it clear that it doesn't matter if a company developed the AI model themselves or if they bought it from someone else. If that model was trained on illegally obtained data, they're still liable.
Wait, so even if a company buys an AI model from a third party, they're still responsible for making sure that the data used to train that model was obtained legally?
Absolutely. They can't just plead ignorance and say, we didn't know where the data came from. The EDPB is saying that companies have a responsibility to do their due diligence and understand the provenance of the data that was used to train any AI model they're using.
That's a pretty big shift in thinking. It sounds like this is going to have a major impact on the whole AI industry.
I think it will. Companies are going to have to be much more careful about where they get their data from and how they use it to train AI models. And they're also going to have to be much more transparent with users about how their data is being used.
So it sounds like this EDPB opinion is a big win for data privacy. But what does it all mean for us, the everyday users of AI? How can we actually protect ourselves in this new landscape?
Well, that's exactly what we're going to be exploring in the final part of our deep dive. We'll be talking about some practical steps you can take to protect your data privacy in the age of AI.
Sounds good. We'll be right back after a quick break.
All right, welcome back. So we've talked about a lot of heavy stuff, how AI models can absorb this personal information. The EDPB is trying to, crack down on this illegal data use. It's a lot.
It is. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there.
But it's important stuff. So let's bring it all home. Like, what does this all mean for us, for us, everyday folks who are using these AI-powered services? What can we actually do to protect ourselves and our data? Well, I don't think anybody needs to become a cybersecurity expert overnight. A good first step is just being more aware, when you're using a chatbot or a recommendation engine or anything that's powered by AI. Just take a second and think about, where did the data for this thing come from?
Yeah, kind of like checking the label on your food, right? We want to know what's going into this AI that we're consuming.
Exactly. And this is where, the EDPB's push for transparency is so important. They want companies to make it clear how their AI is trained, what data they're using. So, don't be shy about actually looking for that information.
Yeah, we're not just passive users. We have a right to know what's going on. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And beyond just knowing, remember, you have rights when it comes to your data. You can request access to your data. You can ask for corrections. You can even demand deletion in certain cases.
So if I found out that a company used my data illegally to train an AI, I could actually fight back and have it removed.
Yeah, exactly. The GDPR gives you those tools to protect your privacy.
Yeah.
And the EDPB is trying to make sure that those tools apply to AI as well.
This is pretty empowering, but it also feels like, AI is moving so fast and the laws are always playing catch up. So how do we even stay ahead of the curve on this stuff?
Well, it's true. It's a very dynamic, constantly evolving landscape. The key here is to just stay curious and informed. Don't be afraid to, dive into those privacy policies, ask questions, and if something feels off, don't hesitate to actually exercise your data rights.
Be a data defender, not a data sheep.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
And remember, you don't have to figure this all out on your own. There are a ton of resources out there that can help. Articles, podcasts like this one, advocacy groups. So definitely take advantage of those.
Yeah, and speaking of resources, this EDPB opinion that we've been talking about, it's focused on the GDPR, which is, European law. So what about, the rest of the world? Are there any similar regulations or legal things that we should be thinking about?
That's a great question. And it's definitely complicated. The whole landscape of data protection laws, it varies so much from country to country. But the GDPR is, it's one of the most comprehensive frameworks out there. And a lot of other regions are starting to think about, how to deal with AI and data privacy as well.
So even if you're not in Europe, it's still probably a good idea to pay attention to what's happening with the GDPR, because it could influence how other countries approach this whole AI regulation thing.
Yeah, for sure. And then beyond specific laws, there are some broader legal questions out there that are still being debated. Like, what about intellectual property rights? If an AI is trained on, copyrighted material without permission, could that lead to a whole other set of legal problems?
Yeah, that's a great point. It seems like we're really just scratching the surface here. When it comes to the legal implications of AI,
it is a brave new world. But the more we all learn about AI and data protection, the better equipped we'll all be to navigate it. And, hopefully make sure that this technology is developed and used responsibly.
Absolutely. Yeah. We need to make sure that AI serves humanity.
Right.
Not the other way around. Right.
Right.
And that all starts with understanding how it works and what's at stake.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, hey, thanks for joining us today on this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and maybe even, got you thinking about some things. Remember, knowledge is power. So stay curious, stay informed, and, stay engaged in this whole conversation about AI and data protection. We'll see you next time.